Okay, so federalism, we've talked about implied powers. Now we'll talk about the evolution of the federal system from basically the founding of the country to the present day, okay? These are in the slides. Oftentimes, when somebody is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for many years, maybe even a couple of decades, they tend to be very influential. Sometimes they give their name to the court. So you have the Marshall Court, the Taney Court. We'll talk about those. The Marshall Court, the most important thing we already talked about, McCulloch v. Maryland, the doctrine of implied powers, and Marshall also was very firm on national supremacy. He said if there's ever a conflict between the national law and a state law, provided that the national law is not obviously unconstitutional, the national law is supreme. It trumps the state law. It's always more important. It always wins whenever there's a dispute between the national law and the state law. Again, provided that the national law is not obviously unconstitutional. The other major decision was Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. That set forth a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause, and again, this paved the way for later expansion of federal powers. Now, these different things, the interpretation of the Commerce Clause, the doctrine of implied powers, these things weren't put into play overnight or even over 10 years. I mean, it took decades, in some cases a century. So the stage had been set. The basic constitutional principles had been enunciated, had been articulated, and were there to provide the ability for the federal government to expand its power, but it didn't happen immediately. Okay, in fact, under the Taney Court, you had dual federalism. And dual federalism, as the book explains, says that basically the notion is state and national government, state and federal government are basically separate but equal. They have distinct spheres. There's very little overlap. The national supremacy doesn't really matter because there are very few cases where national law should actually conflict with state law because they should just deal with different situations. And as the book said, it's like a layer cake where you have two different layers of a cake. They touch, but they don't really overlap at all. This is dual federalism. Again, dual, you have two basic areas of government, national, state, very little overlap. Okay, and this was upheld and set forth and upheld again and again by the Taney Court. The idea is the 10th Amendment, which says any powers not explicitly denied to the states or explicitly given to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved for the states or the people. So it's a little vague there at the end, the states or the people. The idea seemed to be that the state governments would uphold the rights of the people more effectively than the federal government. It turned out not really to be the case. But basically, the 10th Amendment seems to limit federal power into saying any power that isn't explicitly given to the federal government by the Constitution or explicitly denied to the states by the Constitution is reserved for the states. Okay, and this was the basis of dual federalism, the basis of the Taney Court's decisions. So basically, one of the most important was in Dred Scott, which is a famous or an infamous case for many reasons. But one of the things that the Taney Court actually ruled in that is that Congress cannot pass laws outlawing or limiting slavery in any territory. Only states can do that. Okay, so the Taney Court basically said slavery is not something about which Congress can legislate because the Constitution never says that. Okay, so Congress has no business trying to pass laws regarding slavery, trying to pass laws saying that this state will be free or this state will allow slavery because again, it's not in the Constitution. It's not explicitly given that power by the Constitution. Therefore, it doesn't have that power. Now, again, then you have the Civil War. Things started to change. The national government became more powerful. The passage of the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15th amendments, 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. And now the 14th Amendment would go on to be the most important for various reasons, in part because it has the Equal Protection Clause. And basically the idea of the 14th Amendment says you have certain rights as a citizen of the United States, as a citizen of the national government, that no state can take away from you. So as a citizen of the United States, as a citizen of the national government, you have certain fundamental personal freedoms that no state can take away from you. Okay, now in reality, maybe not at the time because of Reconstruction, but shortly afterwards, states did begin to take those powers away through segregation. Okay, so again, as we've seen several times with Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which denounced slavery, the actual draft, which said all men are created equal, even though all men were not equal in the country that was eventually founded. And now again, with the 14th Amendment, there's a tension between the ideal and the reality. The ideal was all citizens of the United States, as citizens of the United States, have certain fundamental personal liberties that no individual state can take away. Now, it took about 100 years for that to really be put into practice by the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But again, the seed was sown, it was in the Constitution at that point. The 14th Amendment is the only part of the Constitution that mentions equality, but it says people are basically, people have, states cannot deny people equal protection of the law. But again, even though these things were there, the Taney Court continued to uphold dual federalism, maybe most famously in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld segregation as constitutional. And they said basically, again, this is up to the states. I mean, on the one hand, they said as long as the facilities are separate but equal, it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. But it went on and sort of said, look, these sorts of things, civil rights, voting, stuff like this is left up to the states. So again, dual federalism. The states have their sphere, the national government has their sphere, very little overlap, and the states are supreme in their sphere. This was the Taney Court. Now again, things were happening that would have long-term, very important consequences. The 16th Amendment, okay, that gave the national government the power to levy income taxes. So over time, that gave them the ability to gain a great deal of money. And we'll see, once they started to team up with the states, since the national government had more money, they had more power. Okay, but the 16th Amendment gave the national government the ability to collect income taxes. 17th Amendment made the senators elected directly by the people. So again, they were no longer direct representatives of the states. They were no longer dependent on state legislatures to be elected or to be reelected. And they no longer thought of themselves as representatives of the states. Okay, so again, long term, this had important consequences. Okay, cooperative federalism was the next major stage. So you go from dual federalism, which again, as the book says, like a layer cake, to cooperative federalism, which is like a marble cake. There's all kinds of overlap between the state and the federal government. This was basically ushered in by the New Deal. Now, FDR passed various New Deal legislation. Congress passed it. FDR signed it into law. The Supreme Court struck some of it down. It said it's unconstitutional. The federal government cannot get involved in some of these ways, regulate the states in some ways. FDR threatened to actually expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court because the Constitution doesn't specify there have to be 9. So he threatened to expand the number and basically put people who would be friendly to him on there. And the Supreme Court basically backed down and said, okay, all this New Deal stuff is okay. It's all constitutional. So then you move from dual federalism, which state and local, different spheres, very little overlap, to cooperative federalism, where state and local cooperate on all sorts of projects. Okay, and with this partnership, again, because the national government has so much more money, they basically call the shots. They can influence the states simply by threatening to withhold money. A great example, the drinking age. It's up to the states to set their own drinking age. They have that right. No one has ever denied that they have that right. But at one point, the national government decided they wanted a national drinking age of 21 years. That they wanted the national drinking age to be 21 years old. They knew that they didn't have the constitutional power to simply enforce that. So they said any state that doesn't have a drinking age of 21 will not get federal highway money. California wanted to have a drinking age of 18. But when the federal government said, well, if your drinking age is 18, that's fine. We can't stop you from doing that. But if that happens, we will take away all of your money for roads and highways, which would be, disastrous for any state to lose all the federal money for funding highways and so forth. So California changed their drinking age to 21. In the case of civil rights, again, 1954, the Supreme Court said segregation is unconstitutional. They kept saying you need to desegregate in the South. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said any state that is still segregating their school system will not receive federal money for education, will not receive any federal money for education. The southern states, which have been dragging their feet, trying for so long not to desegregate, when there was that threat, when there was the threat of losing federal funding, they almost instantly desegregated. They realized that was too much of a threat. So again, once the state and the federal government start to cooperate, start to form partnerships, and the federal government has so much more money, then they have so much more power because the states become dependent on the federal government. So with cooperative federalism, the federal government expands its power, not through taking it away from the states in an aggressive way, not through doing anything unconstitutional, just by being in partnership with the states and having so much more money, and therefore making the states dependent on the federal government.